Fascism is a complex ideology. It is very dangerous to throw the term around like a common insult. Fascism is varied and is often paired with Nazism, racism, and just in recent years, Donald Trump supporters. The term jumps all over the place. But the question is there a centralized definition of fascism? When we look at fascism in general, we look at examples such as Hitler's Nazism as the prime example for fascism. Of course, Hitler's fascism became the most popular, but there was another important figure before him, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini founded the Fascist Party. He coined the term fascism in 1919. Funny known fact, Mussolini was actually a communist, but changed his views in the beginning of World War I. The word fascism comes from the Italian word fascio, meaning a bundle or group. It is also a term for a militant brotherhood. It is the idea that a group would be stronger together than individually. The bundle of sticks goes back well before Mussolini. It goes back to ancient Roman times, from the word fasces, which means an axe bound with sticks. It is a symbol of unity and official strength. The discovery of a miniature iron set of fasces in a 17th century BCE Etruscan tomb confirms that the Romans got the idea of fasces from the Etruscans. So that is to say, the origins go far back. Let's get back to Mussolini. The axe bound with a bundle of sticks became a symbol of the fascist movement. Mussolini's fascism from 1919 was a blend of extreme nationalist expansion with social elements such as programs like women's suffrage and workers' power. The fascist leaders took little to no time to water down their main message. This allowed the conservatives and the existing governments to gain power from joining Mussolini. Fascist governments appeared in other European countries that were struggling from the aftermath of World War I. There was also a threat from socialism. Here's a list of fascist movements: the British Union of Fascists, the Australian New Guards, and not to forget the National Socialist German Workers' Party, other known as the Nazi Party. In March of 1919, the Action Squad, or known as the Black Shirts, were armed groups of Italian fascists under Mussolini. They were organized to destroy the political and economic organizations of socialists. But by the end of the 1920s, the Black Shirts resorted to attacking more than just socialists, as they attacked communists, Republicans, Catholics, trade unionists, and people who were in collectives. These violent attacks resulted in hundreds of people that were killed as fascist squads continued to expand. On October 24th, 1922, a fascist convention in Naples gave an excuse for the Black Shirts all over Italy for the famous March on Rome that put Mussolini in power. The government tried to appease Mussolini by naming him prime minister, but that wasn't enough, as in 1925, Mussolini made himself a dictator. This resulted in Mussolini violently suppressing the opposition. He was praised and was brought up to god status. Mussolini even violently expanded into Ethiopia, Albania, and other countries. In 1939, Mussolini allied with Nazi Germany to prepare for World War II. Hitler learned a lot from Mussolini's fascism. He learned the importance of using propaganda and violence. In the 1920s, Hitler led his Nazi party to prominence through his dramatic speeches, grand entrances, and his way of speaking against the Jews, Marxists, liberals, and internationalists. In 1933, Weimar Republic President Paul von Hindenburg named Hitler Chancellor, in which he hoped Hitler would be the one to stop the growing threat of the Communist Party. By that very summer, Hitler's rule was transformed into a dictatorship. Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles and rearmed Germany to begin invading neighboring countries. The invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939 started World War II and the Holocaust. The rise of the European fascist ideas inspired regimes throughout Latin America. This included Bolivia and Argentina. These Latin countries had things in common with the European countries. They also experienced a hard time during the Depression. These countries also had unsuccessful government systems. Argentina was a very wealthy country in 1900. They exported grain and meat, but those markets crashed and Argentina became poor. So in desperation, they turned to a military leader who had populist appeal. Spain and Portugal were dictatorships as well. They lasted until 1975, and those governments were a combination of conservative and fascist parties. Fascism requires some basic loyalties, such as to the nation, to national dignity, and to a master race or group. The core principle, or fascism's only ethical trait, is to make the nation stronger, more dominant, and successful. Fascists see national strength as the only thing that makes a nation prosperous. Fascists adhere to this goal and will do anything to achieve it. One of fascists' main objectives is to use the country's resources to increase the country's power. This leads to a nationalization of assets. It is at this point fascism resembles Marxism. If Marxism was the idea of countries sharing resources and an economic idea, fascists attempted the same thing within a country. Fascism is led by the principle of extreme nationalism. Fascist governments tend to execute similar actions as Marxists, but the essentials are still different. Fascist governments excel at propaganda and make use of impressive events, such as parades and grand entrances by leaders. Fascists blame and demonize selected groups. The demonized groups do vary between country and time. For example, the Nazi government demonized Jews and others, while Mussolini's fascist regime targeted the Bolsheviks. In the beginning, Mussolini had nothing against the Jewish population. He often worked with Jews. But because Mussolini was allied with Hitler, he eventually added anti-Semitic segments to his regime. Overall, Mussolini's views were different than Hitler's on the issue of biological racism. In the essay, The 5 Stages of Fascism by Robert Paxton, published in 1998 in the Journal of Modern History, Paxton outlines 7 feelings that act as mobilizing passions for fascist governments. Here's a list of the 7 feelings. Number 1. The superiority of the group. Supporting the group feels more important than maintaining either individual or universal rights. Number 2. Believing that one's group is a victim. This justifies any behavior against the group's enemies. Number 3. The belief that individualism and liberalism enable dangerous corruption and have a negative effect on the group. Number 4. A strong sense of community or brotherhood. This brotherhood's unity and purity are forged by common conviction, if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. Number 5. Individual self-esteem is tied up in the greatness of the group. Paxton called this an enhanced self of identity and belonging. Extreme support of a natural leader, who is usually male. This results in one taking on the role of a national savior. The beauty of violence and of will when they are devoted to the group's success in a Darwinian struggle. Paxton wrote, the idea of a national superior group, or, especially in Hitler's case, biological racism, fits into a fascist interpretation of Darwinism. Once fascist governments are in power, they suppress individual freedoms, imprison people who don't agree with them, prohibit protests, use unlimited police power in the name of national unity and revival, and committed military aggression. Paxton wrote, the economics of fascism are very complex. The fascist government's supposed goal was national self-sufficiency. In the 1920s and 1930s, fascist leaders claimed this is the middle ground between bourgeois, profit-based capitalism and revolutionary Marxism, which would dismantle many social institutions and prosecute the bourgeois. The Library of Economics and Liberty defined fascism's economic practices, basically as socialism with a capitalist coding. According to Paxton, fascism claims to eliminate the private sphere, but that does not happen in reality. To understand fascism's economic structure, it is best to look at who is benefiting from it. Take Hitler for example. He was backed up by the wealthy elite from almost the very beginning, such as big business. Hitler received slave labor, government contracts, etc. The fascist regime in Italy was a bit more problematic. The poor benefited in the beginning of Mussolini's rule. As his positions changed, the poor suffered. Both in Germany and in Italy, fascist government cartels existed to determine many of the characteristics of trade, finance, agriculture, and manufacturing. They made decisions based on how to further the nation's power, yet they still allowed the conservative business elite to conserve property and increase their wealth. The cartels lowered wages by force and paid the workers with national pride. One notable characteristic of fascism is the partnership of capitalists and the conservative elite. When fascists start out with their radical ideas, they always work to move in the direction of protecting private property. Of course, this is not the end goal. As a result, the alliance with the capitalists and the conservative elites is an awkward alliance at best. Before I continue, I want to make perfectly clear that conservatives are not inherently fascist followers and are not fascists themselves. Conservatives are people of order and want to use things as the church and property to maintain that existing social order. Fascists, on the other hand, are revolutionists. They want to break up any social organizations that stand in the way of gaining more national power and expansion. In Nazi Germany, for example, businessmen were not keen on Hitler. This is because Hitler had anti-capitalist views from the very beginning. Eventually, Hitler and the conservatives discovered that they had a common goal. They made an alliance, but they did conflict very often. Over time, this conflict became very problematic for the conservatives. On July 20th, 1944, the conservatives had enough of Hitler and tried to assassinate him. That is to show that conservatives and fascism usually don't mix. According to Lachlan Montagu, a Melbourne, Australian-based writer and researcher of fascism, stated that being asked to define fascism is probably the scariest moment for any expert of fascism. In 1944, much of the world was still influenced by many fascist regimes. Famous author George Orwell wrote his essay titled, "What is Fascism?" Orwell said that fascism is very difficult to define. He added that much of the problems with defining it was the fact that many fascist regimes were very distinct from one another. It is not easy, for instance, to fit Germany and Japan in the same framework, and it is even harder with some of the small states describable as fascist. Fascism will always take on individual traits of the country itself. This is why there are very different regimes. For example, in the essay The 5 Stages of Fascism, Paxson wrote that religion would play a much greater role in authentic fascism in the United States than it would in the more non-religious Europe. National variations of fascism are more divergent than national variants of communism or capitalism, which is to say that fascist regimes are quite varied. To make matters more complicated, some non-fascist governments have often imitated the fundamentals of fascist regimes to give the illusion of force and national strength. For example, take mass mobilizations, like people that wear "Make America Great Again" and Donald Trump clothing. They may resemble the Nazi brown shirts marching around, but of course that is exaggerated. They are intentionally mimicking elements of fascist regimes, so it shouldn't be assumed that they automatically equate to a fascist political practice. Now, it starts to become more obvious that people calling every little thing fascist is the fact that some people are paranoid, but also see elements of fascism in these groups. There is a reason why fascism is so hard to define. The misuse of the definition of fascism creates problems as well. The term fascist has been misused so much by using it as an insult that the meaning has been diluted. Most notably, the inherent evil the word conveys. At this point, the ice cream man can be a fascist. Fascism is distinct from other political, social, or ethical philosophies such as communism, capitalism, conservatism, socialism, or liberalism. Fascism does not have an established philosophy. Paxson wrote, "There was no fascist manifesto, no founding fascist thinker." Throughout 20th century history, fascist regimes have required specific socio-cultural and political conditions to intensify. It is also important to note that in many countries, such as Britain in the 1920s and 1930s, have seen the increasing popularity of fascist ideas without them coming to power or fascist parties becoming influential in politics. One of the most important stages for fascist regimes requires extreme national catastrophes to gain power and popularity. For example, the defeat in World War I. Many of the people in Germany and Italy were concerned about their culture of their countries. The people were promised so much, national glory and expansion, yet there they were, ashamed and upset that they lost the war. World War I caused so many problems to arise. After the war, there were a large number of irritated men who had been on the front lines, and as a result, had seen too much death and destruction one could possibly imagine. They got used to the death, and that lessened the value of life, unlike the people who didn't go to war. In order to set up fascism, it requires a general belief that the standard government parties and organizations are just too incompetent of improving the general situation. In early 20th century Europe, World War I increased the general distrust of government. War veterans felt that they were betrayed by their own politicians who carelessly sent them to die. The skepticism towards government combines a national identity that was proud yet vulnerable at the same time. For example, Italy was a small nation that had once ruled much of the known world but no longer did. Many German citizens felt the Treaty of Versailles was destroying them. In Australia, many people felt they deserved more power than they currently had. The United Kingdom was starting to see their great empire losing power. In order for a fascist party to become more powerful, they need the combination of a strong national identity and bitterness towards the government. But even having all that, there needs to be a spark of conflict that will make the common people side with fascist speakers. In the case of Germany, and to some degree in Italy, the spark was the Great Depression. The Great Depression and the First World War caused devastation on the German economy, according to Paxton. The war had unleashed inflation, and everyone who had savings or was living on a fixed income, like retired people, saw their money dwindling away. The people were very desperate and humiliated, to the point that they would accept a more extreme system of government as long as they had a chance of reverting back to the good old days. In Paxton's The 5 Stages of Fascism, he said that fascism could only develop when a society has known political liberty and have seen democracy established long enough that people can be dissatisfied with it. Italy became a chain of short-lived governments, while Germany had no effective governmental majority for 3 years before Hitler became chancellor. Two main solutions appeared to fix the problem of unsuccessful government, people's suffering, and national humiliation. The two systems proposed were communism and fascism. Paxton makes clear that the rise of fascism is not really logical without the attention to the rise of communism. Both communism and fascism propose to set democracy aside and replace it in order to make the country stronger. In both Germany and Italy, where they both struggled, the left, which consisted of socialists and communists, was picking up more speed, especially in Italy, where it appeared that a socialist revolution was about to happen. The existing government and conservative capitalist elites looked at communism and socialism with disgust. Paxton recognized that another factor of setting the stage for a fascist regime was fascists appealing to conservatives early in the movement. The only chance for fascism to succeed at the time was through the conservative elites. The existing governments of Germany and Italy decided to align with the fascists. A big reason why fascist parties came to the attention of the public was the fact they had a common enemy. The government in both countries offered the fascists the positions in government because they knew that traditional government parties had failed. Both communism and fascism recommended violent solutions. They knew that only one would win by destroying the other. A lot of existing governments have allied with fascists because they were more afraid of a socialist revolution. They refused to work with the political left. This led to a political standstill. A political deadlock is yet another factor Paxton said was required for fascism to come to power. After World War II, fascism mainly became left behind in Europe and North America. Became a political insult, resulting in overuse and lessening the impact of the meaning. Like I said at the beginning of this video, fascism is very complex. There are many definitions of fascism. It can be described as a set of political actions, a political philosophy, or a mass movement. Of course, it could be all of those things. But when defining an ideology, it is best to have a central definition. In my opinion, fascism is commonly associated with the German and Italian regimes. It is a good indicator of what fascism comes down to, but I still think it is a broad definition at this point in time. This is because of the misuse of the word. All in all, when fascism does get implemented, it is a very violent ideology, and I think we can't forget the impact it has had on the 20th century. If we let ourselves become weak, our desperation for a fast political fix might elect the next fascist leader into power. You may be wondering, isn't Antifa a fascist movement? If it fits into the categories that I've mentioned in this video, then the answer is yes. Most of what I've covered in this video is more along the lines of nationalist fascism. My next video will be on comparing fascism to communism to see how they are similar and how they differ from one another. In that video, I will look more to how fascism doesn't always belong on the political right. If you like the content, like and subscribe. If you have any questions for me, ask them in the comment section below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.